The pit cage screamed as it fell. Timber splintered against stone, iron shrieked against iron, and the great engine beam, 40 tons of Northumbrian oak and cast iron, tore loose from its mounting and plunged into the black throat of the shaft. Coal dust rose in a slow grey breath. The air itself seemed to shudder. Below, in the low galleries of the Hester Pit, 204 men and boys lifted their heads from pick and shovel. The lamps flickered. The roof groaned. Somewhere far above, the daylight had gone out. A boy of 10, still clutching a crust of barley bread, whispered his father's name into the dark. The father did not answer. He was listening to the shaft and to the terrible silence that followed the fall. Water began to drip. The mine held its breath. The quiet before the fall. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour has settled upon your side of the dark, let the room grow still. Perhaps it is late in the evening, and the lamp beside you is low. Perhaps it is the small hour before dawn, when even the clocks seem to hush. Whisper the name of your town into the dark if you wish, and let this old voice keep you company for a while. Before we begin, if the sound of these histories soothes you, please subscribe to the channel. A soft tap upon the little bell, a quiet like of this video, helps this small candle burn a little longer in the wide dark of the world. It costs nothing, and it means everything to the telling of these old, sad tales. Now let us drift backward through the years, through the wars and the winters, through the long, slow turning of the earth, until we come to a cold country by a grey sea, in the year 1862. There is a village on the coast of Northumberland. The wind here has a name of its own, though no one ever thought to write it down. It comes off the North Sea in the black hours before morning, and it carries salt, and it carries smoke, and it carries the taste of coal. This is Hartley. New Hartley, some call it, to tell it apart from the older cottages upon the cliff. It is a small place. A single lane of miners' rows, a chapel, an inn, a schoolroom, a shop where a widow sells tea and tobacco and small hard sweets to the children on a Sunday. Beyond the last cottage stands the pit, and beyond the pit the sea. On this morning, the 16th of January, the frost has come down hard. The lane between the rows is white, and the puddles left by the rain of the day before have turned to glass. A single dog barks once, somewhere at the far end of the village, and then falls silent again. The night is not yet finished. The stars are still out over the sea, but in the cottages the wives are already awake. In the third house of the lower row, a woman named Margaret Moore rises from a straw mattress and puts her feet upon a cold stone floor. She is 34 years old. She has borne 5 children, and 3 of them still live. Her husband lies beside her in the shape of a long, dark shadow. She does not wake him yet. She goes to the hearth in her bare feet, and she blows upon the raked ashes of last night's fire until a small red eye opens in the grey. She feeds it a scrap of kindling, then another. The little flame catches and grows, and the room begins to smell of wood smoke, and the black kettle begins to sing. In the next house, and the next, and the next, other women are doing the same. It is the same all along the row. 100 small fires waking in the dark. 100 kettles set upon the hob. 100 thin candles burning on 100 deal tables. The candles are made of tallow, and they smell of mutton fat, and they gutter in the draughts that come through the doors. The women have known the smell of them all their lives. They do not notice it any longer. Margaret takes down a loaf of barley bread from a shelf, and she cuts 3 slices with a black-handled knife. The bread is heavy and dark. It is the bread of colliers' wives, kneaded the night before, baked in the little oven beside the fire. She spreads each slice with a scrape of dripping. The dripping is from the Sunday joint, saved and set aside all week for this purpose. She wraps the slices in a scrap of clean cloth, and she puts them into a tin box the size of a man's hand. The tin is dented at the corners. It has been carried down the pit 6 days a week for 11 years. She sets it upon the table beside a small blue bottle of cold tea. This is her husband's bait. It will be his only meal until the cage lifts him up again into the light. Now she goes to the ladder that climbs to the loft, and she calls up softly. Her voice does not rise above a whisper, for she does not wish to wake the youngest. Two shapes stir in the straw above. Her sons, John and Thomas, aged 12 and 10. They come down the ladder yawning, rubbing their eyes with the backs of their hands. They are already half-dressed. They sleep in their shirts, and they need only pull on their moleskin trousers and their thick woolen stockings and their heavy hobnailed boots. The boots are stiff with cold. They lace them by the fire. She pours a cup of milk for each of them, and she waters it well from the pitcher, for milk is dear and the winter has been long. The boys drink it without complaint. They eat a crust of bread each and a scrape of jam, and they take their own little bait tins from the shelf beside the door. Their tins are smaller than their father's. The bread inside is thinner, but it will do. It has always done. The father, whose name is Robert, rises last. He is a hewer. He has worked the coal for 21 years, since he was a boy of 10 himself, following his own father down the shaft with a candle stuck to the front of his cap. He is a broad man, thick in the shoulder, narrow in the waist, with black hair and pale eyes, and a scar upon his left brow from a fall of stone in his 2nd year underground. He kisses his wife upon the crown of her head. He does not speak. There is nothing to say that has not been said 1,000 times before. He pulls on his flannel shirt and his moleskin trousers and his belt of thick leather with the brass buckle and his waistcoat and his greatcoat over all. He winds a red kerchief about his throat against the wind. He takes down his cap from a peg, and he takes down his safety lamp, and he takes down the little tin of his bait, and he stands at the door. Margaret comes to him. She straightens the kerchief at his neck. She does not look at his eyes. She looks at the buttons of his coat. She says only, "Mind the roof." He says only, "I." And then he is gone into the dark, with his 2 sons behind him, and the door closes, and the cottage is quiet again. She stands for a moment at the closed door. Then she goes back to the fire. She puts the kettle on again. She sits down in the wooden chair beside the hearth, and she waits for the day to begin. Out in the lane, the men are joining together in a slow black river. They come from every cottage. They come from the upper row and the lower row, from the little houses by the chapel and the little houses by the shop. They come with their bait tins under their arms and their lamps in their hands. They come with their sons beside them, for a boy of 10 is a man in a pit, and there is no shame in it, and there is no changing it. The frost crunches under their boots. The stars are beginning to fade above the sea. Somewhere to the east, over the water, the first grey light is coming. They do not speak much. It is not a morning for speaking. A man nods to his neighbour. A boy laughs once, and is hushed by his father. An old hewer coughs the long, deep cough of a man who has breathed coal dust for 40 years. The lane fills with the sound of hobnails upon frozen earth, and with the small clink of tin bait boxes swinging against buttons, and with the low murmur of the sea beyond the cliff. They pass the chapel. The chapel is dark. The chapel bell is silent. The chapel will not ring until the Sabbath. They pass the schoolroom, where in a few hours the smallest children will gather with their slates and their chalk and their prayer books to be taught their letters and their sums by a young man named Mr. Bewick, who came out from Newcastle last Michaelmas and boards with the widow of the shop. They pass the widow's shop itself, its shutters still closed. They pass the inn, the Hastings Arms, where last night some of them drank a half-pint of ale before walking home in the dark. The innkeeper is not yet awake. Only the wives are awake, and the miners, and the sea. Beyond the last cottage the land opens. There is a slight rise, a low hill, and upon the hill stands the pit. And here, at the sight of it, even the boys grow quiet. The pit is not a beautiful thing. It is a hulk of black timber and black brick, wrapped in a thin coat of soot and rime. The great winding house squats beside the shaft, and inside it the winding engine ticks and hisses in the cold, its brass fittings gleaming softly by the light of a hanging oil lamp. Beside the winding house stands the pumping engine house, taller and grander, its roof steep, its chimney rising straight into the pale sky. Within it, if a man were to open the door, he would see the great beam of cast iron, 40 tons of it, rocking slowly up and down upon its trunnion, drawing the water out of the workings far below. The beam has rocked so, without ceasing for many years. It rocks now. It will rock for a few hours more. Around the pit, in the yard, are stacked the timbers and the ropes and the corves and the tubs. A pit pony stands tethered to a post, its breath steaming in the frost, waiting to be led down to its stable in the workings. A tallyman sits at a small table with a lantern and a book, marking off each man as he arrives, checking the numbered tokens upon their belts. The tokens are of brass. Each man has his own. When a man is below, his token hangs upon a hook by the shaft. When a man is above, his token is in his pocket. There is no other reckoning of the living and the dead. Robert Amor gives his token. His sons give theirs. They join the line at the shaft mouth. The shaft is a black circle in the ground. It is not large. A man might stand upon its edge and stretch out his arms and almost span it. Yet down that circle a rope descends, and upon that rope hangs a cage, and in that cage the men are lowered into the earth, 12 at a time, half in the upper deck and half in the lower. The cage comes up now with a slow rumble of the winding engine, and the empty seats within it are dark, and the men step aboard without hesitation, for they have done it every working morning of their lives. The cage swallows Robert and his eldest son. The next cage will take the younger boy. The gate closes with a small iron clang. The bell above the winding house rings once. The engine sighs. And Robert Amor is carried down into the darkness of the Hester Pit, 600 feet below the frost, below the sea wind, below the grey Northumbrian dawn. He does not look up as he goes. He never has. There is nothing to see, only the black wall of the shaft sliding upward past his eyes, and the little pool of yellow light at his feet from the lamp of the man beside him, and the smell of coal, and the smell of damp, and the smell of the deep old earth. At the surface, the tallyman ticks another mark in his book. The pit pony is led into the second cage. The sky over the sea has turned from black to a pale grey, the colour of a gull's wing. In the cottages the fires are burning steadily now. The women are sweeping their hearths. The smallest children are being lifted from their cradles and washed with warm water from the kettle. In the schoolroom, Mr. Buick is lighting the little stove. In the chapel, the sexton is fetching in a load of coal for the vestry fire. The village of Hartley is waking to another working day, as it has done, without complaint, for as long as any of its people can remember. The morning is cold. The morning is quiet. The sea is grey. The sky is grey. The frost still holds the lanes. And in the winding house upon the low hill above the sea, the great cast-iron beam rocks, slowly up and down, upon its trunnion, drawing the water out of the workings far below, as it has done every hour of every day for many years. It rocks now. It rocks steadily. It rocks as the second cage descends, and the third and the fourth and the 204 souls are gathered one by one into the belly of the earth. Somewhere within the iron, a hairline crack has been growing for a long time. No man knows of it. No eye can see it. It runs through the deep grain of the metal like a thin, cold thread. Every stroke of the beam draws it a little further along. Every rise and fall of 40 tons of iron urges it a little wider. It has been there for months, perhaps for years. It waits, patient as the sea, and in the low grey light of the January dawn, the beam rocks on. The Hester Pit. The Hester Pit had been sunk in the year 1845, and in the 17 winters since, it had become the whole of Hartley's living. Before the pit, the village had been a scattering of fisher cottages upon the cliff, and a few small farms upon the poor thin soil above the sea. The men had drawn a hard bread from the water and from the sheep, and their fathers had done the same, and their grandfathers before them. Then the coal masters had come with their surveyors and their theodolites, and they had walked the fields with slow, deliberate steps, and they had marked the ground with wooden stakes. and where the stakes had stood, the earth had been opened, and the shaft had been dug, and the village had changed forever. The shaft went down 600 feet. 600 feet is a great distance, though it is not easily pictured by a mind that has never stood at the top of such a hole. It is the height of a cathedral spire set upside down in the earth. It is the length of a rope so heavy that a team of 8 strong horses could scarcely drag it across a field. It is a black column of empty air, walled with brick and stone, cut straight down through clay and shale and sandstone and thin bands of ironstone, until at last it reaches the seam of coal for which it was made. The seam is called the low main, and it is a bed of black glossy coal about 3 feet thick, laid down between roof and floor of dark grey stone. The shaft is only 12 feet across. It is a narrow throat. Every man who works in the Hester Pit must pass down through that throat in the morning, and every man must pass up through it again at night. There is no other way. There has never been another way. The masters had sunk one shaft, and only one, for a second shaft costs a second fortune, and the masters were thrifty men. They had reasoned that one shaft was enough, and no law of the land compelled them to sink 2, and the miners of Hartley had never known any other manner of pit, and so they had thought nothing of it. A single black circle in the ground, a single rope, a single cage, a single road up and a single road down. Within the shaft the space was divided. On one side went the cage, up and down upon its rope, carrying men and coal. On the other side hung the great pump rods, which reached from the beam engine at the surface all the way to the sump at the bottom, drawing up the water that seeped forever through the rock. Between the cage side and the pump side there ran a partition of stout oak boards, called the brattice. The brattice served also to divide the air. Fresh air was drawn down one side of the shaft by the movement of the furnace fire at the bottom, and foul air was drawn up the other side, and by this circulation the workings were kept fit to breathe. It was not a good air. It was never a good air. But it was air enough for a man to live in, if the brattice held, and if the furnace burned, and if the shaft was open above. At the pit bottom, the shaft opened into a low chamber called the shaft inset. Here the cages were loaded and unloaded, and here stood the small brick stable for the pit ponies, and here the onsetter directed the tubs of coal onto the cage as they came in from the workings. From the inset ran the main gallery, a passage cut through the coal, 7 feet high and 9 feet wide, propped every few paces with timber. Along the floor of the gallery ran a set of iron rails, upon which the tubs travelled. The tubs were small wagons, wooden, iron-bound, holding some 500 or 600 weight of coal apiece. They were dragged along the rails by the ponies and by the young boys called putters, who bent their backs to the work and pushed and pulled the tubs from the coal face to the shaft. From the main gallery branched the side galleries, and from the side galleries branched smaller passages still, and at the far ends of these smaller passages stood the coal faces, where the hewers worked. A hewer's place was a low black chamber, sometimes only 3 feet high, cut into the seam. He worked upon his side, or upon his knees, or lying flat upon his back, with his pick in his hand, and his candle stuck to the front of his cap. He hewed the coal from the face by feel as much as by sight, for the lamplight was small and the black wall was smooth. He heard the coal before he saw it fall. He heard the little crack of the pick, and the soft sigh of the seam giving way, and the heavy thud of the lump upon the floor. Then he broke it smaller with his hand and his short-handled hammer, and he loaded it into a corve, and the corve was drawn away to the tub, and the tub was drawn away to the shaft, and the shaft carried it up into the daylight, and the daylight was 600 feet away. There were 400 souls in that pit on any given working day. That was the number, or thereabouts, that came and went through the single shaft. Men and boys, and the older lads who worked as putters, and the youngest lads of 8 or 9 who worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark beside a wooden door and pulling it open when the ponies came through. A trapper's work was nothing but to open and shut a door. He sat upon a small stool cut from a lump of wood. He sat there for 12 hours. He had a candle at first, but candles were dear, and often the trapper sat in the dark with only the sound of the water dripping and the far-off rumble of the tubs and the creak of the timber above his head. He learned to know the ponies by the sound of their hooves. He learned to know the putters by their whistling. He learned to know the silences, and which silences were only quiet, and which silences were the sort a boy should be afraid of. Above the shaft, at the surface, stood the winding house and the pumping engine house. The winding house held the winding engine, a steam engine that turned a great drum of iron. The rope for the cage was wound about the drum, and as the drum turned, the cage rose or fell. The engine man sat upon a small wooden bench beside the engine, with his hand upon the lever and his eye upon the indicator that showed him where the cage was in the shaft. He knew the shaft as a shepherd knows his hillside. He knew when to slow the engine and when to stop it and when to reverse it. He never took his eye from the indicator when a cage was moving. If he had done, a man might be crushed against the roof of the shaft or dropped to the sump. The pumping engine house was the taller building. It stood a little apart from the winding house. Within it stood the great beam engine, one of the largest in all the north. The beam was a single casting of iron, 40 tons in weight, 40 feet in length, rocking upon a stone trunnion set in the middle of the house. One end of the beam went out through the wall and stood over the mouth of the shaft. From that end hung the pump rods, which reached down into the workings. The other end of the beam was worked by the piston of the steam cylinder, which was fed by boilers in the yard behind. Every stroke of the piston lifted one end of the beam, and every fall of the piston lowered it, and by this slow, patient rocking, the pump rods were driven up and down, and the water was drawn out of the sump, and the workings were kept dry enough for a man to live in. Without the beam, the pit could not be worked. Without the beam, the water would rise. The water was always rising. The water came from the North Sea, which lay only a little way to the east, and it came from the streams above the hill, and it came from the old workings that had been driven long ago into the same seam. Water was the great enemy of the coal masters, more than fire, more than gas, more than the fall of stone. Water could drown a pit in a single night if the pump stopped. Water could turn a working colliery into a still black lake, from which no man ever came up again. And so the beam rocked day and night without ceasing. It rocked upon Sundays, when the pit was silent and the miners were at chapel. It rocked upon Christmas, when the winding house was empty, and the wives were roasting their small joints of pork. It rocked in the summer, when the heat was heavy upon the yard, and in the winter, when the frost was hard upon the roof. It rocked through storms, and it rocked through calm. It had rocked so for many years, and every man in Hartley had grown so used to the slow, deep beat of it, coming across the fields, that he no longer heard it. It was as the pulse of the village. It was heard only when it stopped. The engineer of the pumping engine was a man named Robert Wilkinson. He was 53 years old. He had been in charge of the beam for 9 years, and before that he had tended other engines in other pits, and before that his father had tended engines, and before that his grandfather had been a whitesmith in Newcastle. He was a small, spare, careful man with grey hair and a grey moustache, and a habit of walking slowly around his engine 3 times a day, tapping the joints with a small hammer, listening to the sound the iron gave back. He was proud of his engine. He kept the brass bright with a scrap of leather, and he kept the oil cups filled, and he kept the boilers clean. He had never had a stoppage in his time. He believed the engine to be sound. He was not to blame. No man was to blame. The great beams of the pumping engines of that age were cast in one piece at the ironworks, and no man knew, in the year 1862, that iron itself could weary. The masters did not know it. The engineers did not know it. The learned philosophers who studied the strength of materials did not yet know it, or if they suspected it, they had not yet put it into words that any coal master could read. The word for it, in the years that followed, would come to be fatigue. The iron would tire. The iron would grow weak under the endless small blows of its own working. A crack would open in the deep grain, and the crack would grow, and one day, without warning, the iron would part. But that word was not yet in use. And so the beam rocked, and Robert Wilkinson tapped his joints, and the pit went on. Below the beam, the 204 souls of that day's shift were now at their places. The hewers were at the faces, cutting coal by candlelight. The putters were dragging the tubs along the iron rails, calling to their ponies with soft, familiar names. The trappers were sitting alone beside their doors in the dark. The onsetter was at the shaft inset, loading tubs onto the cage. The overman was walking his rounds with a lamp in his hand, checking the timber and the air. Somewhere, a man was singing, very low, a hymn he had learned as a boy at the chapel. Somewhere, a pony was blowing softly through its nostrils. Somewhere, water was dripping from the roof into a small dark pool upon the floor. Robert Amore was at his face, on the west side of the workings. His elder son John was putting for him, dragging the corves along the low passage to the tub road. His younger son Thomas was farther out, at the trap door on the main gallery, sitting on his little stool in the dark. The three of them were now separated by a quarter of a mile of black passage and coal, but each of them knew the others were near, and each of them worked the more steadily for it. Above them, 600 feet above, the beam went up. The beam came down. The pump rods rose and fell in the shaft. The water flowed slowly up the pipes and out into the drain that ran across the yard and down the field toward the sea. The cage was rising toward the surface with a load of coal. It carried also 8 men, coming up early from the night shift, who had finished their work and were bound for their breakfasts and their beds. The engine man in the winding house watched the indicator. The cage was 200 feet from the top. Then 150. Then 100. Somewhere, deep within the iron of the great pumping beam, the hairline crack, which had grown for so long in silence, reached at last the last thin thread of sound metal. The beam did not know it. The engineer, walking his slow round with his little hammer, did not know it. The men in the cage rising toward the daylight did not know it. The women at their hearths in the village did not know it. The beam went up. The beam paused at the top of its stroke, as it had done 10 million times before. And then, in the quiet of the January morning, with the frost still hard upon the yard and the sea grey beyond the cliff, the iron began to give. The breaking of the beam. The morning had aged. The frost that had glittered so hard upon the lanes at dawn was now beginning to thin under a pale sun that could not quite warm the yard. It was near 10:30. In the village below, the wives had swept their hearths and set their bread to rise a second time, and the smallest children had gone to the schoolroom with their slates under their arms. In the shop, the widow was measuring out an ounce of tea into a twist of blue paper for a farmer's wife from Seaton. In the chapel, the sexton had finished sweeping the aisle. It was, in every way, an ordinary morning in Hartley. In the winding house upon the low hill, the engine man watched his indicator. The cage was rising. It had left the shaft bottom 2 minutes before, laden with a great load of coal in the lower deck, and 8 men in the upper. The 8 men were of the night shift. They had worked from before midnight until now, and they were coming up early, for their work was done, and the day shift was already at the coal. Their names would be written in the newspapers within the week. Now they were only tired men with black faces, standing shoulder to shoulder in the small iron room of the cage, waiting for the daylight. Their names were Ralph Robinson, and William Sharp, and Thomas Watson, and George Emerson, and John Taylor, and Edward Armstrong, and 2 younger lads whose surnames were kept badly in the ledgers of the pit. They were speaking of small things. One of them had promised his wife a length of ribbon from the shop at Seaton, and he was reckoning in his head what a yard of it would cost him. Another was thinking of his breakfast. A third was thinking of nothing at all, for a man at the end of a 12-hour shift is often past thinking, and the mind goes soft and warm, and the body only waits to lie down. The cage was 200 feet from the top. Then it was 150. Then it was 100. In the pumping engine house, Robert Wilkinson had just come in from the yard. He had been out to look at the boilers, and he had left the door open a little behind him, and a cold, clean draught of air was blowing across the polished floor. He carried his small hammer in his right hand. He meant to tap the trunnion joint, as he did at this hour every day. He walked slowly across the boards. He looked up at the beam. The beam was rising. It rose with the same slow patience it had shown every day since he had first come to it, 9 years before. It rose until it stood almost at the top of its stroke, tilted upward toward the sky, its great dark bulk filling half the height of the house. Then he heard a sound he had never heard before. It was not a loud sound. That was the strangeness of it. A man who works beside a beam engine for 9 years learns the sound of every valve and every joint and every gasp of steam, and when a new sound comes, it strikes him more than a shout. The sound was a small dry crack. It might have been a walnut breaking under a boot. It might have been a green branch snapping in a cold wood. It came from the middle of the beam, from the very heart of the iron above his head. Robert Wilkinson stopped. He looked up. He did not move. The beam trembled once, very lightly, at the top of its stroke, and then, without any further warning, without any further sound, the great iron split. It split across the middle, at the point where it lay upon the trunnion. It split as a green log splits under an axe, cleanly and along the grain. For a single instant the two halves of the beam hung apart above him, held only by the last thin fibres of the metal. Then those two gave way, and 40 tons of iron came apart in the air. The outer half of the beam, the half that stood over the shaft, was the heavier. It had upon it the weight of the pump rods, hanging down into the dark. When it broke free of the trunnion, it swung outward and downward toward the shaft mouth. It struck the great stone lintel above the shaft as it fell. The lintel cracked. Bricks flew loose from the top of the shaft wall and clattered upon the yard. The beam turned once in the air, slow and dreadful, like a felled tree, and then it plunged head first into the black circle of the shaft. The engine gave a great sigh. The steam that had driven it, having no beam to lift, escaped in a long white plume from the valves and rose into the January air. The wheels went slack. Somewhere a bell began to ring. Somewhere a man was shouting. In the winding house next door, the engine man saw his indicator jump. He did not understand at first. The cage was 100 feet from the top. The rope was drawing steadily upon the drum. He had felt no shock in his own engine. And yet the indicator moved, as though a great weight had come suddenly upon the rope from the other side of the shaft. He put his hand upon the lever. He looked at the shaft mouth through the small window in the wall. Down the shaft 40 tons of broken iron were falling. They fell straight for perhaps 30 feet. Then they struck the timbering of the shaft wall, and the timbering broke, and the beam tumbled and turned in the narrow space. It struck the brattice. The brattice was of oak, thick and sound, but the beam was iron, and the beam was travelling now with the whole weight of the sea behind it. The brattice tore away in long splintered lengths. It fell after the beam into the dark. The ascending cage was 100 feet from the top. It was rising still, for the winding engine did not yet know to stop. In the cage stood the 8 men of the night shift. They heard the crack above them. They looked up. They saw for one moment a shape coming down out of the daylight, filling the whole width of the shaft, black and vast. One of them may have cried out. One of them may have reached his hand toward the iron bars of the cage as though to hold on. There was no time for more. The beam struck the top of the cage. The cage was crushed, as an egg is crushed in a shut hand. The iron of the beam and the iron of the cage came together and became one thing. The rope above snapped. Timber and pump rods and brick and men and cage and beam went down together, all at once, into the deep of the pit. They fell, and they fell, and they fell. 600 feet is a great distance. It is time enough for a man to say a prayer. It is time enough for a man to remember his wife's face. But whether any of the 8 had that time, no living soul would ever know. They struck the pit bottom at last. The sound of that striking travelled up the shaft as a low, deep drum, and out into the yard, and across the fields, and into the village. Men in the lanes stopped where they stood. A woman drawing water from the pump in the row raised her head. A child at his slate in the schoolroom lifted his eyes to the window. It was not a loud sound. It was a felt sound. It was the sort of sound that a body knows before a mind does. Something had happened at the pit. In the winding house, the engine man had already thrown his lever. The drum went still. The rope hung slack from the drum, its end lost in the dark. He came out running. He was a man of 40. He had lived in Hartley all his life. He ran to the shaft mouth. The dust was rising out of it in a slow grey column, thick as a chimney's smoke. The lintel above was cracked. The brickwork about the top of the shaft was broken and leaning. 2 of his own men, who had been in the yard near the shaft, were sitting upon the frozen ground, dazed, with bricks around them. One had a cut upon his cheek. The other was staring at the shaft and saying nothing. Robert Wilkinson came out of the pumping engine house. He was pale. His hammer was still in his hand, though he did not know it. He walked to the shaft mouth as if in a dream. He stood beside the engine man. He looked down into the dust. He could see nothing. The shaft was full of the grey column of the dust. Even the light of the pale sun above could not reach into it. He said, in a voice that surprised him by its steadiness, "God have mercy." The engine man said, "The beam is gone." Robert Wilkinson said, "Aye, the beam is gone." They did not speak of the men. Not yet. The men were beyond speech. The men were below the beam, and below the cage, and below the pump rods, and below all the timber of the shaft. The men were sealed in. Word of what had happened travelled with the speed of frightened air. A boy who had been leading a pony across the yard turned and ran, first to the office of the viewer, then to the row where his mother lived, then he did not know where. A tallyman came out of his hut with the token book still in his hand. An overman from a neighbouring colliery, who had come to Hartley that morning upon some small business of his own, ran to the shaft mouth and knelt at the broken edge and called down into the dust. He called and called. No voice came back. In the village, a young woman named Mary Sharp, whose husband had been in the ascending cage, was standing at her cottage door, shaking a rag out into the frost. She heard the sound of running feet coming up the lane. She heard the sound of a man's voice, high and broken, calling a name that was not her husband's. She did not go inside. She stood in the doorway with the rag in her hand, and she watched, as one by one the doors of the row opened, and the wives came out into the lane, still in their aprons, still with flour upon their fingers, and they walked, all of them, toward the pit. Margaret Amore heard the running feet from her own hearth. She had just set the kettle on for her morning tea. She heard a woman scream, once, very far away. She set down the kettle. She wrapped a shawl about her shoulders. She looked once at the closed door of her cottage. She thought of Robert, and of John, and of Thomas, 600 feet below the earth. She opened the door and stepped out into the lane. At the pit, a rope was being lowered. Not the winding rope, for the winding rope hung slack now, its cage gone. Another rope, a hemp rope kept in the yard for emergencies, was being tied about the waist of a young sinker named William Colson, who had been the first man of skill to reach the shaft mouth. He had come down at a run from the neighbouring pit at Seaton Delaval. He was known through the district as a sinker, one of those brave, half-mad men who went down into new shafts with pick and rope and light. He knew shafts better than any man of the coast. He asked no questions and made no speeches. He tied the rope beneath his arms. He stepped upon the edge of the broken brickwork. He said to the men above, "Lower me slow." And then he was over the edge and into the dust, and the pale sky was above him, and beneath him was a darkness that no one yet understood. 60 feet down he went. 90 feet. 120. The rope creaked. The dust closed above him, and the daylight became a small, pale disk, the size of a coin held at arm's length. The air smelled of coal and of splintered wood, and of something else, sharper and worse, that a sinker knew and did not name. At 140 feet his boots touched something. It was not the pit bottom. It was iron and timber and stone, all pressed together into a great choke that filled the shaft from wall to wall. He stood upon the choke and he beat upon it with his hand. He called out. No sound came back to him from below. He looked up. Far above him, at the top of the shaft, a ring of small faces looked down. They were black against the pale sky. He could see them, but he could not hear their voices. He gave a single tug upon the rope, twice, sharp, the signal to be raised. The rope tightened. He rose slowly toward the daylight. And below him, sealed beneath 140 feet of broken beam and shattered timber and fallen stone, 204 men and boys of Hartley were beginning to understand that the sky had closed above them. The ceiling of the living. The first thing they knew of it, in the deep galleries of the Hester Pit, was the sound. It came down the shaft as a low, rolling thunder, and then as a great striking, and then as a long, slow sigh of dust and broken air. The men at the coalface lifted their heads. The ponies stopped in their tracks. The candles guttered upon the caps of the hewers, and one or two of them went out. A boy who had been whistling stopped in the middle of a note and did not begin again. Robert Amor was on his side at his working place, cutting into the seam with the point of his pick. He felt the sound before he heard it. The floor beneath his hip trembled once, softly, as a sleeping dog trembles in a dream. A small stream of coal dust ran down out of the roof above him and settled upon the back of his hand. He held very still. He listened. He had worked the coal for 21 years. He knew every sound the earth could make. He knew the small soft crack of the seam giving way to the pick. He knew the deep groan of the timber settling under the weight of the roof. He knew the sudden bark of a fall of stone in the far galleries, and he knew the flat clap of a shot fired by a shot man. This was none of those. This was a new sound. This was a sound that came from above, not from within, and it carried in it a weight that did not belong to the pit. He put down his pick. He crawled backward out of the low chamber, dragging his lamp with him. He stood up in the passage, bent almost double, for the roof was low. His son John was there with a corve half-loaded. The boy was looking toward the sound. His face in the candlelight was very pale. "Father," the boy said, "what was that?" Robert Amor did not answer at once. He was still listening. The rumble had stopped now. There was only the small, ordinary sound of the pit again, the dripping of the water, the far creak of a timber, the soft blowing of a pony somewhere down the gallery. But there was one sound missing. He could not think for a moment what it was. Then he knew. He could no longer hear the beat of the beam. The beat of the beam was a thing a Hartley collier heard without hearing. It came down the shaft as a slow, soft pulse. Once every few seconds, day and night, every hour a man was underground. It was the pulse of the pit itself. It said to a man, the water is being drawn up, the shaft is open, the sky is still there. Robert Amor had never once in 21 years worked at the coal without that pulse in his ears. He had ceased to notice it long ago. He noticed now only its absence. He said to his son, quiet as he could, "Stay by me." He took the boy by the arm above the elbow. He began to walk, half-stooped, along the low passage toward the main gallery. As he walked, other men came out of their working places and joined him. They came with their lamps in their hands and their picks upon their shoulders, and their faces black and their eyes very wide. No one spoke. There was nothing to say yet. They walked, and their boots made a soft muffled sound upon the wet floor, and the candles upon their caps threw small yellow rings upon the roof above them. Farther along they met the overman. His name was Thomas Ord. He was a man of 45, thick-built, with a great grey moustache and a lamp of his own that burned brighter than the caps of the hewers. He carried in his belt a small brass whistle and a tally board. He was walking quickly, but not running, for a man in charge of a pit does not run before his men. He stopped when he saw the little company coming out of the west workings. He held up his lamp. Robert Amor said to him, "The beam." Thomas Ord said, "Aye." He said it very quietly. He said, "Come with me, and bring your lads." They went then toward the shaft. Others were coming with them from other galleries, out of the north workings and the south, hewers and putters and drivers, some of them still holding a lump of coal or a length of rope, forgotten in their hands. There were older men among them, hewers of 50 and 60, who had worked in half the pits of the coast, and there were young boys of 8 and 9 who had been trappers at the small doors. The little trappers had left their doors. This they had never done before. But now the sound had come down the shaft, and no man in the pit had thought to send them back. Thomas Amor, the younger boy, 10 years old, came running out of the dark of the main gallery to meet his father. He had left his own trapdoor, and he had come without asking. His face was white under the coal dust. He was crying, but he was making no sound, only tears running slow down his cheeks and leaving a track through the black. Robert Amor bent down and took him up under one arm, as though he had been 3 years old and not 10, and he carried him so, and the boy put his face against his father's shoulder and hid it there. Robert Amor walked on. He said nothing to the boy. He said nothing to anyone. They came in this way to the shaft inset. Here the ceiling was higher, arched with brick, and the space opened out, and here already a small crowd of men was gathered, perhaps 60 or 70, standing very still and looking upward into the mouth of the shaft. More were coming in every moment from every gallery. The onsetter was there, an old man named John Watson, who had loaded the cages for 18 years. He was standing with his hand upon the little iron gate, and he was staring up, and his mouth was open a little. The men who came in fresh from the workings looked up in their turn. What they saw stopped them. The shaft rose above them as a long black tunnel, walled with brick and stone, 600 feet high. In the ordinary working of the pit, a man looking up the shaft from the inset saw far above him a small round pale disk of daylight, like a coin at the end of a long dark barrel. The disk was small, but it was there. It said, "The sky is above you." It said, "The world is waiting." It said, "In 12 hours you shall be there again." There was no disk now. The shaft was choked. Some way up, perhaps 140 feet above them, an enormous mass of iron and timber had jammed across the whole width of the shaft, and it hung there in the dust, and above it there was no daylight, and below it there was no sky. What light there was in the inset came from their own lamps, and from the little candles upon their caps. The upward shaft was black as a shut oven. Timber was still falling. Splinters of it, and small pieces of brick, and now and then a great length of shattered pump rod, came clattering down from the choke and struck upon the floor of the inset. The onsetter, John Watson, had already dragged one of the ponies clear of the shaft mouth. The pony was standing now against the far wall, trembling all over, its ears flat back upon its head. The cage rope hung down in a loose black coil upon the floor. The cage itself was gone. There was no cage. The 8 men who had been in it were gone also, and the cage and the men were somewhere below the choke, or somewhere within the choke, or somewhere ground into the choke itself. No man in the inset spoke of them. No man yet let himself think of them. Thomas Ord stepped forward. He was the overman, and he had the ordering of them. He raised his lamp high, and he turned to face the men, and his shadow leapt about the walls of the inset. He said, in a voice that was steady, because he made it so, "Listen to me now." The men listened. Even the boys were silent. He said, "The beam has broke. The shaft is choked. There is no cage. There is no way up until they clear the shaft." He paused. He looked from face to face. He looked at Robert Amor and at the boy still hid against his shoulder. He looked at the old hewers he had known since he was a boy. He looked at the smallest trapper, standing at the edge of the crowd with his hand in the hand of a bigger boy. He said, "We are 204 souls in this pit. There is air. There is water. There is timber for lamps. The masters above will send sinkers, and the sinkers will clear the shaft, and we shall be brought up. But it will not be this hour. It may not be this day." He paused again. He said, "We shall gather. We shall keep together. We shall keep the air good. And we shall do as I say." There was a small silence when he had done. Then an old hewer, whose name was William Colson, no kin to the sinker above, but a Colson of the village, coughed once into his fist and said, "Aye, Tommy." And another said, "Aye." And another. And the word "aye" went through the crowd, one man taking it up after another, in the low, deep voices of colliers, and it filled the inset like a slow amen in a chapel. They set to work at once, as men will when work is offered. It is one of the small mercies of the old trade that a collier is never long at a loss when there is a task before him. Thomas Ord ordered them into parties. Some he sent back into the middle workings, where the air was still fresh, to bring up jackets and planks and whatever timber they might find loose, for he had a plan already forming in his mind for a wall of boards to hold back the foul air that would come. Some he set to gathering the lamps and counting them, for oil was now their most precious good, and every drop of it must be reckoned. Some he set to the mustering of the boys and the taking of their names, and the sitting of them along the wall in a row where they might be seen and counted and looked to. Some he sent to fetch water from the small, clean sump at the foot of the west gallery, where the pumps had drawn the drip of the roof into a clear little pool. 2 of the older hewers he called aside. They were men he trusted. One was Robert Amor. The other was a man named Michael Rie, 60 years old, 40 years a collier. He drew them apart from the others, near the wall of the inset, and he spoke low, so that the boys should not hear. He said to them, "You know the pit as I do. You know the workings above. There is only one shaft. There is no other road." Robert Amor said, "Aye." Michael Rie said nothing, but he nodded once, slow. Thomas Ord said, "The choke is 140 feet up, or thereabouts. That is iron and timber and stone. It will not be moved in a day." Michael Rie said, "No, it will not." Thomas Ord said, "And the beam is gone, and the pumps are gone." Robert Amor understood then. He looked at the floor of the inset. The floor was wet. It had always been wet. A small dark stream ran along the side of the passage from the west, and it slid down a little channel cut for it, and it went away into the sump. In an ordinary hour, the beam above would have been drawing that water up the pipes and out into the drain in the yard. There was no beam. The stream was still coming. The water would begin to rise. He did not say it aloud. Michael Rie did not say it aloud. Thomas Ord did not say it aloud. But each of the 3 men knew it, and each of them saw, in the eyes of the others, that the others knew it also. Above them was iron. Below them, in time, would be water. The pit was a bottle now, and the bottle was stoppered, and the water was slowly coming in. Thomas Ord said, "At last, we shall move them back to the yard seam." The yard seam was a higher gallery, driven above the main workings some years before. It stood higher than the sump. Water would take longer to reach it. The air there was still good, and there was room enough for 200 souls to lie down together upon the floor. Robert Amor said, "Aye." Michael Rie said, "Aye." They went back to the crowd. Thomas Ord raised his lamp again. He said, "We shall not stay here at the shaft. We shall go up to the yard seam. Fetch your lamps. Fetch the boys. Come along quiet, and keep by me." They gathered themselves then, and they came, all of them, up the low sloping passage that led from the inset toward the yard seam. The pony was led with them. The lamps went in a long, slow yellow line through the dark, dipping and rising with the tread of the men. Robert Amor walked near the front, with his younger son upon his hip and his elder son at his side, gripping the edge of his father's coat. Michael Rie walked at the back, counting heads as they passed him, and marking each with a small nod, though he had no slate to write upon. 204. He knew the number already. He did not need to reckon it twice. Somewhere far above them, beyond the choke, beyond the broken lintel, beyond the ring of small pale faces at the shaft mouth, the January sun was climbing a little higher over the North Sea. It shone upon the frost of the yard. It shone upon the black smoke of the boilers, which still burned though there was no engine to feed. It shone upon the road that ran down from the pit to the village, and upon that road a slow dark line of women had begun to move. The village at the pit head. The lane from the village to the pit was not a long one. It ran only a quarter of a mile up the slope of the low hill, past the chapel and the schoolroom and the widow's shop, and out through the last gate onto the yard. In an ordinary hour, a strong woman could walk it in 10 minutes with a basket upon her arm. On this morning, the walk took longer. The women came out of their cottages one by one, in the order that the news had reached them, and they joined the lane in a long, slow line that grew thicker as it climbed. They came in their aprons. They had not stopped to change. Some had flour still upon their hands from the bread they had been kneading. Some had a wet cloth still clutched in their fingers, forgotten from the hearth. Their shawls were pulled up over their heads against the frost, dark shawls of brown wool and grey, and beneath the shawls their faces were pale. Their clogs made a hard, flat sound upon the frozen lane. It was a sound the village had heard 1,000 times, at the shift change, at the end of the day, when the men came home from the pit. It was a sound that belonged to the men. Today it was the women who made it. Margaret Amur was among the first. She had not run. A collier's wife does not run to the pit. She had walked steadily, with her shawl about her shoulders and her hands folded before her, as though she were going to chapel. She had left her fire burning. She had left the kettle upon the hob. She had not locked the cottage door. There was no thief in Hartley on that morning, and there would be none for many days to come. Beside her walked Mary Sharp, whose husband had been in the ascending cage. Mary Sharp was 23 years old. She had been married a year and a half. She had a child of 6 months at her breast, wrapped inside her shawl against the cold. The child was asleep. Mary Sharp did not speak. She only walked. Her eyes were fixed upon the black shape of the pit at the top of the hill. Margaret Amur walked beside her and did not try to speak either. There was a decency between them that would not be broken with words. Behind these two came the others. There was Elizabeth Robinson, whose husband Ralph had also been in the cage. There was Sarah Watson, whose husband Thomas had been in the cage. There was Anne Emerson, and Isabella Taylor, and Jane Armstrong. 6 of the 8 women of the ascending cage were walking that lane, though they did not yet know for certain that their husbands were the dead. They had heard only that something had happened at the shaft. Word had come running down from the pit yard upon the tongue of a pony boy, and the boy had known only what he had seen, and what he had seen was a broken lintel and a shaft full of dust, and a man being lowered upon a rope into the dark. Behind these women came the wives of the men still below. And these were many. 204 men and boys were in the pit, and each had someone in the rows. Some had a wife. Some had a mother. Some had a sweetheart at whom they had winked as they passed her door that morning. Some had only a sister who kept house for them, or an old grandmother who fried them their bacon on a Sunday. From every cottage of the lower row and the upper row and the small houses beyond the chapel, the women came out and joined the lane. They came also from farther. Word had run down the coast road toward Seaton sluice before the sun was high. A boy of 12, sent for that purpose by a foreman at the pit, had run the 2 miles at his best pace, and he had told the news at every door he passed. From the little rows at Seaton sluice came aunts and cousins and sisters, for many of the Hartley colliers had kin along the coast. From old Hartley, up on the cliff, came the older folk, the grandmothers and the grandfathers, walking slower, leaning upon sticks. From New Delaval, and from the small farms along the road, came still more. By noon, there was scarcely a family in the north of Northumberland that had not heard. The children came too. A woman with a child at her hip does not think of leaving the child. A woman with 3 children in the cottage does not know which to leave and which to bring, and so she brings them all. The lane filled with them. Boys of 6 and 7 walked beside their mothers with their hands in their mothers' hands. Girls with plaited hair and clean pinafores came with slates still under their arms, for the schoolroom had been emptied when word came in through Mr. Bewick's window, and he had turned the children out and locked his door and come himself to the pit. The smallest were carried. One woman, whose name is not now remembered, carried 2, 1 on each hip, and she carried them the whole 1/4 mile without stopping. They came to the yard. The yard was already crowded, though it was scarcely an hour since the beam had broken. Men from the neighbouring pits were there. Foremen and viewers and enginemen from Seaton Delaval, from Cramlington, from Backworth, had come at a gallop upon what horses they could find. Sinkers were there, hard-weathered men with ropes coiled upon their shoulders and picks in their belts. A doctor from the village had come, and another was riding down the coast road from Blythe. The chapel minister, whose name was the Reverend Charles Armstrong, was there in his black coat with his prayer book under his arm. He was speaking to no one. He was looking into the shaft. The shaft mouth had been roped off. 2 lengths of thick hempen cord had been strung upon posts about it, and beyond the cord the yard was kept clear so that the sinkers might work. On the far side of the cord, the ground rose a little into a low bank, and it was upon this bank that the women were gathered. They did not push. They did not cry out. They did not call the names of their men. There was a stillness upon them that a stranger would not have understood. It was the stillness of the north, and the stillness of the pit villages, and the stillness of women who had known, all their lives, that this hour might come. Every collier's wife in Northumberland knew that any morning her husband walked down the lane might be the morning he did not walk back. She knew it as she knew the price of a pound of tea, or the day of the week. She did not speak of it. She simply held it, quiet, in the back of her mind, as a woman holds a piece of iron in her apron pocket for luck. Margaret Moore stood at the edge of the bank. She could see the shaft mouth. She could see the broken bricks about it, and the pale column of dust that still rose slow out of the black hole, and the sinker's rope hanging loose against the frame. She could see William Colson himself, the sinker who had gone down, standing beside the rope now with his cap in his hand and his hair wet at the temples. He was speaking to a group of men in the yard. She could not hear what he said, but she could see, in the tilt of his head and the hunch of his shoulder, the shape of the words. He was telling them the shaft was choked. She put her hand on the shoulder of the woman beside her. It was Mary Sharp. She said nothing. She only put her hand there and left it. Mary Sharp did not turn her head. Her arms tightened about the sleeping child in her shawl. The morning wore on. The pale sun climbed as high as it would go in a January sky, and it stood a little way above the sea, and it was of no warmth at all. The frost softened in the yard where the boots of the sinkers passed, and it hardened again where they did not. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman began, very quietly, to say the words of the Lord's Prayer. She said them under her breath, so low that only she could hear, and yet the woman beside her heard and joined in, and then the next woman, and the next. It went across the bank as a slow whisper. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The words moved from mouth to mouth, and they did not rise above a murmur, and they did not stop. Even after the prayer was finished, it began again. Some of the women said it in English. A few of the older ones, from families that had come long ago from Ireland or the Highlands, said it in another tongue. It made no matter. The words were the same. At the shaft, the sinkers had begun to lower a second man. His name was Matthias Chapman. He was a sinker from Backworth, 30 years old, with a rope tied about his waist and a small lamp fixed to the front of his cap. He carried also a short iron bar. He was to go down and touch the choke and try, if he could, to move a single loose piece. William Colson watched him go. The rope went slow over the pulley. Chapman went down into the dust and vanished. The women on the bank watched. The Lord's Prayer went on and on. Someone had thought to bring bread and a churn of tea. It was a woman from the widow's shop, who had opened her tin box and taken out every loaf she had and every twist of tea, and had set them in a basket and had brought them up the lane. She went now among the women on the bank, and she gave each one a piece of bread and a small tin cup of tea. She said no other words than, "Here, love." She said it to the wives of the men in the cage. She said it to the wives of the men below. She said it to the young girls with slates. She said it to the old grandmothers leaning upon their sticks. Some took the bread. Some could not. Those who could not held it in their hands and did not eat. Word came, presently, that Matthias Chapman had returned to the surface. He was drawn up slowly, and when he came into the daylight he was black from head to foot, and his eyes were streaming from the dust, and he could not at first speak. He was helped down to the yard and sat upon an empty barrel and given a cup of brandy. He drank it slowly. Then he stood up and walked to a small knot of men. He spoke to them for perhaps a minute. His voice did not carry to the bank, but the men who had heard him turned then to the crowd, and one of them raised his hands to speak. He was the viewer, the man in overall charge of the workings. His name was John Colson, a distant cousin of the sinker William. He was a tall man in a long dark coat, with a face weathered by 40 years of collieries. He climbed upon an upturned tub so that the women might see him. The Lord's Prayer stopped upon the bank. He said, "We have heard from below. The men are alive." For a moment there was no sound at all upon the yard. The dust column from the shaft rose slow into the sky. The sea murmured beyond the cliff. A single gull called somewhere, far off, and the sound was thin and lost. Then a woman on the bank cried out. It was a small sound, half a word, and it was covered at once by her hand upon her own mouth. Another woman put an arm about her. Margaret Amor did not cry out. She only closed her eyes, and she thought of Robert and of John and of Thomas, and she felt her knees soften beneath her a little, and she leaned upon the woman beside her, and the woman leaned back. John Colson raised his hand for silence, though there had been no noise. He said, "They are gathered together in the yard seam. They have air, and they have water, and Thomas Ord is with them, and he keeps them in good order." He said, "The sinkers are working. They shall work through the night. They shall work through tomorrow. They shall not stop." He said, "Go to your homes. Go to your fires. Send us a woman in your place, one at a time, for the news, and we shall send word down the lane every hour." He climbed down from the tub. The women on the bank did not move. None of them went home. Not one. They stood upon the bank in their shawls and their aprons and their clogs, and they drew the children in close about their skirts, and they turned again to face the shaft. Mary Sharp did not weep for her husband. She had not yet been told that he was among the dead. She stood and she waited, and the child at her breast slept on. Margaret Amor turned her eyes back to the small dark circle in the ground, and she thought of her boy Thomas, 10 years old, sitting in the dark 600 feet below her feet, and she made in her heart a small promise that she would not leave the yard until he was drawn up, alive or otherwise, to the light. The pale sun began to fall westward, toward the hill. The frost that had softened in the yard began to harden again. Somewhere behind the winding house a man was calling for more rope and more lamps and more strong arms. And upon the bank, the long dark line of the women of Hartley settled itself for its long waiting, as behind them, over the sea, the first faint colour of the winter afternoon began slowly to fade toward evening. The sinkers from Seaton. The word had gone out along the coast, and by the middle of the afternoon the sinkers were coming in. They came in 2s and 3s upon whatever wheels they could find. Some came in the small carts of their own collieries, sitting upon coils of hempen rope with their picks between their knees. Some came upon farm carts borrowed at a gallop, sharing the boards with churns and turnips and a startled sheep. Some came upon foot, having run the last mile from the coast road, and they came into the yard breathing hard, with their breath white about their beards, and their coats open, and their caps in their hands. They were a breed apart from the ordinary collier. A hewer worked the coal in a pit already sunk. A sinker sank the pit itself. He went down into new ground where no man had been before, and he dug the shaft with pick and shovel out of raw earth, and he timbered the walls as he went. A sinker learned the way of a shaft as a shepherd learns the way of a hillside. He learned where the stone was rotten and where it was sound. He learned which timber would hold and which would split. He learned to hang upon a rope in a black hole with nothing beneath his boots but 400 feet of empty air, and to work with a steady hand while he hung so. There were not many such men in all of Northumberland. Every one of them who could be reached that day had been reached, and every one of them had come. William Colson stood at the shaft mouth to meet them as they came. He was a man of 50. He had sunk more shafts along the coast than any other man living. His father had been a sinker before him, and his grandfather had been a sinker before that. He wore that day a short, thick jacket of brown fustian, and a pair of moleskin trousers stiff with old clay. His beard was grey at the chin and black at the sides. He had a slow, deep voice that carried without shouting. Every sinker who came into the yard came at once to him, and asked no other questions, and took his orders as if they had been given by a king. He set them to their tasks in the plain northern manner, with few words. To 2 men from Seaton Delaval he gave the sharpening of picks. To 3 from Cramlington he gave the coiling of a great new rope that had been brought up from the store at Blythe. To 4 from Backworth he gave the lowering of oil lamps into a wooden crate. so that each might be handled without a spark. To Matthias Chapman, who had already been down once and knew the shape of the choke, he gave a small slate and a stub of chalk, and he bid him draw for the others what he had seen. Chapman sat upon the barrel where he had drunk his brandy, and he drew slowly upon the slate, and the sinkers gathered about him and looked over his shoulders. He had seen, at 140 feet down, a mass of iron and timber and stone jammed across the shaft from wall to wall. He had touched a great flat piece of the beam itself, warm yet from the friction of its fall. He had touched a length of pump rod bent double upon itself. He had touched the splintered end of a great oak brattice board. He had felt, beneath his boots, a slow shifting of the whole mass, as of a thing not yet settled. He had smelled, coming up from below the choke, a faint, sour breath of coal gas, mingled with the sweeter and worse smell of the afterdamp. He drew these things upon the slate as best he could. He was not a scholar. His letters were slow and thick, but the sinkers understood what he had drawn, and each in his turn nodded, and no man among them made light of it. William Coulson listened without speaking. When Chapman had done, he took the slate from him and studied it for a long moment. Then he said, in his slow, deep voice, "We shall go down in pairs, and we shall cut a way through." He said, "We shall not hurry. A hurried sinker is a dead sinker." He said, "Every man shall come up when I call, and every man shall go down when I call, and no man shall argue with me while this work is on." And the sinkers, gathered about the barrel in the pale afternoon, said "I," and "I," and "I." The first pair to go down was William Coulson himself, and a young sinker from Cramlington named Christopher Barras. Barras was 22 years old. He was tall and thin, with red hair beneath his cap and a chip broken from his front tooth. He had sunk 2 shafts in his life. He tied the rope beneath his arms with the steady fingers of a man who has done it 100 times. He looked once at the ring of women upon the bank. He did not smile, for that would not have done. He only touched the brim of his cap and turned away, and stepped over the broken brickwork of the shaft mouth. They went down together upon 2 ropes, one man before the other, with a distance of 10 feet between them. William Coulson went first. He carried a short pick and a coil of thinner cord about his shoulder. Barras carried an iron bar and a small lamp. As they went, the ring of daylight above them shrank slowly to the size of a saucer, and then to the size of a shilling, and then to a small pale coin. The dust of the fall still hung in the shaft. It settled upon their eyelashes and upon the backs of their hands. It got into their throats and set them coughing, and each man swallowed the cough as best he could, for a coughing man upon a rope is a man who does not attend to his rope. They came at length to the choke. William Coulson's boots touched it first. He felt it beneath him, as Chapman had said, a great uneven floor of iron and timber, tilted, unsound, groaning very softly under his weight, as though it were a beast asleep. He steadied himself upon his rope. He waited until Barras came down beside him, and set his own boots upon the mass. Then together they knelt upon it, and they held up their small lamp, and they began to look. The lamp threw a yellow ring upon the ruin about them. Here was a length of the great beam, black iron, cracked across, its edges bright where the fracture had opened. Here was a bent pump rod, thicker than a man's leg, twisted like a rush. Here was a piece of the cage, the iron bars of it flattened as though a smith had beat them upon an anvil. Here was a great slab of oak from the brattice, splintered along its length. And here, half buried between iron and timber, William Coulson saw a thing that he did not name aloud, but that he knew for what it was. It was the sleeve of a jacket, and there was an arm within the sleeve. He drew Barras gently away from that place and turned him to the other side of the choke. There would be time enough for that later. There was other work first. He set Barras to the iron bar, and he took up the pick himself. They began to strike at a piece of the timber that lay uppermost, meaning to cut it free and send it down through a gap in the mass, so that it should not fall upon them when the rest was moved. They worked slow. They worked careful. Every stroke of the pick was a small measured blow, and every stroke was followed by a moment of listening. If the mass had shifted beneath them, they would have known it. If a piece of stone had loosened from the wall above, they would have known that also. They struck, and they listened, and they struck again. Above them, at the surface, the second pair of sinkers were being made ready. Their names were Thomas Watson of Seaton and George Emerson of Backworth. They stood beside the shaft with their ropes about their waists, waiting for the signal. On the bank, the women watched. A few had at last sat down upon the frosty grass, spreading their shawls beneath them. Most still stood. Margaret Amore still stood. Mary Sharp still stood, with the sleeping child at her breast. Presently the rope from below gave a small sharp tug, and the men at the winding gear knew to draw the first pair up. William Coulson and Barris came up slowly out of the dust, and they came into the daylight with their faces black and their eyes bright, and their hands cut in a dozen places. They stepped over the brickwork onto the yard. William Coulson said only, "Send Watson and Emerson down." He said it in the same slow, deep voice as before, as though he had come up from a walk about his garden. Then he sat upon a stone by the winding house wall and drank a cup of tea that a woman had brought him, and he did not speak again for several minutes. Barris sat beside him. He did not drink his tea at first. He held it in both hands, and he looked down at it, and after a while he began to shake. It was not the shaking of fear. It was the shaking of a body that has held itself steady for too long. William Coulson looked at him once and put a hand upon his shoulder and left it there. Barris drank his tea after a little. The shaking stopped. Watson and Emerson went down. They worked at the choke for an hour, and they were drawn up again, and another pair went down. So it went. Pair after pair, hour after hour, the sinkers descended into the black shaft and cut at the ruin of iron and timber, and were drawn up and rested and went down again. They worked in short spells because no man could work long upon that unsteady floor. They worked in pairs because no man should be alone upon it. They worked in silence for the most part, save for the small sharp sound of the pick upon the iron, and the low murmur of one man to another, and the far creak of the rope upon its pulley. The afternoon deepened. The pale sun sank behind the low hill. The sea beyond the cliff turned from grey to a darker grey, and then to a slow blue-black, and the first of the evening stars came out above the water. In the yard, someone lit a great oil lamp upon a post beside the shaft, and someone else lit another, and another. The women upon the bank were lit now by the yellow of the lamps rather than the pale of the day. Their faces did not change. They watched still. A few of the children had been taken home at last by grandmothers, but most had stayed, and the smallest slept now upon their mothers' laps. Word came now and then from below. A piece of timber had been cut free and lowered away into the depths. A piece of pump rod had been broken with a sledge and sent down after it. A slab of oak had been drawn up upon a rope and laid in the yard, and the women looked at it and looked away. It was only a slab of oak. It was also a piece of the roof that had closed above their men. Twice a sinker came up wounded. The first was a man from Cramlington who had taken a splinter of iron in the palm of his hand. The doctor bandaged it in the winding house, and the sinker went back to the yard and asked to be lowered again, and was refused, and swore softly, and sat down beside the fire. The second was Christopher Barris. He had returned to the shaft for his second spell, and a piece of brick had come loose from the wall above the choke, and it had struck him upon the shoulder. He came up pale, with his left arm hanging heavy. He said nothing about it until he was in the light, and then he sat upon the stone beside the winding house, and he let the doctor cut his shirt away, and the shoulder was black already with the coming bruise. He said, when the doctor was done, "Is there another rope?" William Coulson said, "No, Christopher. Not for thee. Not this day." Barris said, "Aye then." And he sat, and he watched the shaft, and he did not go down again that night. By the time the first true dark had come down upon the yard, the sinkers had cut through the topmost layer of the choke. There was now a small hollow in the ruin, 3 feet deep, into which a man might crawl and work. It was not much. It was not a tenth of what must be cleared. But it was a beginning. William Coulson stood at the shaft mouth in the lamplight, and he looked down into the dark, and he called for the next pair. 2 men from Seaton stepped forward, and they tied their ropes, and they went over the edge. Upon the bank, the long, dark line of the women had not moved. A wagon had come up from the village with more bread and more tea, and a barrel of soup that a farmer's wife had cooked in her own kitchen, and the women took what they could and passed it back along the line. No one spoke of going home. The stars came out above the sea in their old familiar order, and the frost came down harder upon the fields, and the great oil lamps at the shaft threw their yellow light upon the black column of dust that still, very faintly, rose out of the pit. 600 feet below the frost, in the yard seam, 204 men and boys were sitting close together in the dark. Their lamps were low. Their air was still good, for the moment. But down the long passage from the shaft inset, a faint, sour breath was beginning to move. It came slow. It came patient. It came from the workings below, where the water was beginning to rise, and where the old foul gases of the pit were beginning to stir in their sleep, and to seek a way upward toward the living. The foul air. The night deepened upon the yard, and the frost came down harder upon the fields, and the great oil lamps threw their yellow rings upon the black column of dust that rose still from the shaft. But 600 feet below that yard, in the low arched gallery called the yard seam, there was no lamplight of any great strength, and there was no dust. There was only a slow, patient air that had begun, in the last hour, to change. Thomas Ord was the first to notice it. He had walked the length of the yard seam for the third time that hour, counting his lamps and his boys, and he had come at last to the far end of the gallery, where the passage bent to the south and opened toward the old workings. He stood at the bend, and he held up his lamp, and he sniffed the air. The flame of his lamp, which had been steady all evening, gave a small, quick tremble. It settled again. He watched it a moment longer. It trembled again. He did not speak of it. He turned back into the gallery and walked slowly the length of it again, and as he walked he watched the flames of the other lamps as he passed them. Some were as steady as candles in a chapel. Some had begun to shrink a little at the tip. He came at last to the place where Robert Amor was sitting against the wall, with his elder son John beside him, and his younger son Thomas asleep upon his knee. The boy Thomas had cried for an hour in the first darkness, and had then cried himself out, and had fallen at last into a shivering sleep, with his face pressed into the moleskin of his father's coat. Robert Amor had not moved for a long time. He had scarcely blinked. He had watched the far end of the gallery, and had waited. Thomas Ord knelt down beside him. He spoke low, so that only Robert could hear. He said, "The Stithe is coming." Robert Amor did not startle. He had known it since the first hour. Every collier in the yard seam had known it. Stithe was the old word of the coast for the foul air of the pit, the sour, choking breath that rose from the workings when the ventilation failed. It was made of two evils together. There was the black damp, which was the choke damp, heavy and sour, that stole the sweet air from a man's lungs and left him gasping. And there was the after damp, sweeter and worse, that a man breathed and did not know he was breathing, until his knees gave way beneath him, and he sank down as though for sleep. Both were come now, slow, from the low workings below the seam, and both were creeping toward the gallery in which the men and boys sat. Robert Amor said, quietly, "Then we must build a wall." Thomas Ord said, "Aye, that is my thought." They rose together, and they walked back down the gallery to the middle, where the greatest number of men were gathered. Michael Rie was there, and old William Colson of the village, and half a dozen of the elder hewers. Thomas Ord called them close about him, and he spoke in a low voice, and he did not raise his lamp too high, for he did not wish the boys to see the faces of the older men just then. He said, "The air is turning. We shall build a brattice across the gallery, above the bend, and we shall keep the Stithe on the far side of it as long as we can." He said, "We shall use what jackets we have, and what timber we can carry, and we shall pack the gaps with our caps, and with our kerchiefs, and with whatever cloth is upon us." He said, "We shall put the boys nearest the good air, and the men nearest the wall, and no man shall complain of it, for the boys have lighter breath than we do." The older men said aye, and no man argued. Michael Rie stripped off his own greatcoat where he stood, and he laid it upon the floor. Old William Coulson of the village took off his waistcoat and laid it beside. Then, one by one, down the length of the yard seam, the men of Hartley began to take off their coats. It was a strange sight in the small yellow light of the lamps. 200 men, in the cold deep dark of the earth, standing up from where they had been sitting, and drawing off their heavy woolen coats, and their waistcoats, and their flannel shirts, and folding them neatly, as though for the wash upon a Monday. Some of them, the elder hewers, stood then in their bare shirt-sleeves in the winter air of the pit. Some, the younger, stripped to the waist, and the coal dust upon their chests and shoulders gleamed a little in the lamplight. They did not shiver, or they would not show that they shivered. It was a shame among the colliers of that coast to shiver before a boy. The coats and shirts were carried down the gallery in armfuls, and Thomas Ord and Michael Rie directed the building of the brattice. It was set across the passage at the narrowest place, where the roof came down and the walls came in a little. There was a broken length of timber lying by the wall, and this was set upright as a post, and another was set across it as a rail, and the coats were hung upon the rail, and the flannel shirts were packed between them, and the caps were pushed into the gaps at the top, and the kerchiefs into the gaps at the bottom, and the whole was pressed close together with the flat of the hands. It was not a fine wall. A carpenter would have wept to see it. But it filled the gallery from wall to wall and from floor to roof, and when a man held his lamp before it he could no longer see the far end of the passage, and when he held his lamp behind it, the flame of the lamp grew a little brighter than before. Thomas Ord walked along the wall when it was done. He pressed his hands against it in several places. He listened at it. Then he stepped back a pace, and he raised his lamp, and he looked at the men. He said, "We shall keep this wall between us and the Stithe for as long as we can." He said, "We shall not leave it, and we shall not open it, and no man of the pit shall pass it, for beyond it is death." There was a small silence. Then old William Coulson of the village, who was 62 years old and had worked the coal since he was 9, said, "Then let it stand as long as we do, Tommy lad." And the men said aye, and the boys, who had watched all of this with great round eyes above their bait tins, said nothing, but drew a little nearer to their fathers. They settled themselves upon the good side of the wall. Thomas Ord ordered them once more. The youngest boys, the trappers of 8 and 9 and 10, were placed nearest the fresh side of the gallery, farthest from the wall. The older lads, the putters of 12 and 14 and 16, were placed a little behind them. Then the young men, then the older hewers, then the eldest of all, who took their places nearest the wall itself. This was the order Thomas Ord had chosen, and he had not spoken his reason, but every man among them understood it. If the Stithe came through the wall, it would come first upon the eldest, and last upon the youngest. It was a small mercy, but it was the only mercy the pit could give. Robert Amour laid his younger son Thomas upon a folded coat near the front of the company, and he tucked a spare kerchief about the boy's neck, and he brushed the coal dust from the boy's cheek with his thumb. The boy did not wake. His breath came very small and even. Robert Amour looked at him a long moment. Then he stood up and walked back into the middle of the company, and he sat down beside Michael Rie against the wall of the passage, for he was a hewer of 21 years, and he had chosen his place among the elders. His elder son John came to sit beside him. John was 12. He was not a boy any longer in the reckoning of the pit, for he had put for his father these 2 years past. He said nothing. He put his shoulder against his father's shoulder, and his father put his arm about him, and they sat so, silent, and watched the little yellow light of the lamp before them. The last of the bread was brought forward. There had been little enough of it to begin with. Every man carried his bait tin, and every tin held a slice or two of barley bread and a scrape of dripping, and a small blue bottle of cold tea. The bread of the day shift had been eaten mostly at the ordinary bait hour, at 11 of the morning, before the beam had broken. What was left was thin. Thomas Ord and Michael Rie gathered up what remained. They broke each slice into small pieces upon a clean board that had been part of a corve. They gathered also the last of the tea from all the bottles into a single tin can. They carried the board and the can along the row of boys. Every boy was given a small piece of bread and a small sip of tea. Some of the boys tried to refuse, saying that their fathers had not eaten. Their fathers said, "Eat, lad." The boys ate. When they came to the boy Thomas Amor, who was still asleep, Robert Amor said, "Leave his portion by his hand. When he wakes, he shall be glad of it." Thomas Ord laid a piece of bread upon a folded rag beside the sleeping boy, and he set a small tin cup of tea beside it, and he covered both with a clean cloth against the dust. The men had no bread. Michael Rie said, "We have had our bait. It is the lads who have not." And the older hewers said aye, and no man of them took a crumb. They sat in the dark against the wall of the gallery, and they watched their sons and their nephews and the sons of their neighbours, and they were content. The scythe pressed against the brattice wall. It did not press hard. It came slow. Now and then a small breath of it slipped through a gap at the top, and the flame of the nearest lamp gave its little tremble, and Thomas Ord or Michael Rie rose at once and packed a fold of cloth more tightly into that place, and the flame steadied. The men learned to watch the lamps. The lamps were their eyes upon the air. When a flame stood tall and steady and yellow, the air was still good. When a flame shrank and turned blue at the base, the air was thinning. When a flame went out altogether, the air was dead. Robert Amor had heard of pits where a flame had gone out, and a man beside it had gone out also, in the very same breath, without a cry. He did not speak of this to his elder son, but he watched the lamps, and he watched them close. Somewhere far above them, beyond the choke, beyond the shaft, beyond the frost of the yard, a sinker was being lowered upon a rope into the dust. Somewhere the great oil lamps at the pit head were burning against the January dark. Somewhere Margaret Amor was standing upon the frozen bank in her shawl, her hands folded before her, her eyes fixed upon the small black circle in the ground. She did not know that her husband had taken off his coat for a wall. She did not know that her youngest boy was sleeping now, upon a folded coat beside a folded rag with a slice of barley bread. She did not know, and she would not know for many days, and yet she stood upon the bank as though she knew every hour of it. In the yard seam, Michael Rie leaned his grey head against the wall of stone behind him, and closed his eyes for a moment. He was 60 years old. He had begun in the coal at 9. He had seen falls of stone and floods of water and small fires in the workings, and once, long ago, an explosion at a colliery near Cramlington that had taken 12 men in a single breath. He had never before seen the sky closed above him. He opened his eyes again. He looked at the little row of sleeping boys along the front of the company. He said, very quietly, to Robert Amor, "They are good lads, Robert." Robert Amor said, "Aye." "They are good lads." Michael Rie said, "We shall keep them as long as we can." Robert Amor said, "Aye." They said no more. The lamp before them gave a small, quiet flame. The wall of coats and shirts stood pale in the yellow light. Beyond it, in the dark, the slow, sour breath of the pit pressed and pressed. Somewhere, in the pocket of his moleskin trousers, Robert Amor felt the small, hard shape of his brass tally token. He put his hand upon it through the cloth. It was warm from the heat of his body. It was the only thing he had of the surface. He held it there, and he watched the flame, and he waited for the morning, though he did not yet know if there would be a morning for him at all. The message on the slate. The hours moved slow in the yard seam, and no man among them could reckon them true. There were no clocks below the earth, and no light of morning nor of evening to mark the passing of the day. There was only the small yellow flame of the lamps, and the slow breath of the men, and the slow patient pressing of the scythe against the brattice wall. A man might sit against the stone with his hand upon his knee, and he might think an hour had passed, and it might have been 3, or it might have been 1. The pit had taken time itself away from them, along with the sky. Yet each man knew, in his own body, that the second night had come. He knew it by the ache in his back where the stone had grown into him. He knew it by the dryness of his tongue, for the tea had long been drunk, and the water from the little clean sump beyond the wall was rationed now to a spoonful at a time. He knew it by the way the boys had begun, one by one, to stop asking for their mothers, and to lie very still upon the folded coats, with their eyes half open, watching the flame of the nearest lamp, as a sleeping child watches a candle by a window. It was Michael Rie who first said the words aloud. He had been sitting all evening against the wall with his grey head bowed and his hands folded upon his knees. He raised his head at last, and he looked across the low arched gallery at Thomas Ord, and he said, "Quiet as a man speaks in a chapel, we shall not all be brought up, Tommy." Thomas Ord did not answer at once. He held his lamp a little higher and looked along the row of sleeping boys at the front of the company. He counted them, though he had counted them already 100 times. Then he lowered the lamp and he said, "No, we shall not." Michael Riet said, "Then let a man leave a word for his own." There was a silence after that. It was not a heavy silence. It was the silence of men who have heard a true thing spoken and have no wish to cover it over. Robert Amor, sitting a little way off with his elder son John against his shoulder, heard it as clearly as if it had been said into his own ear. He thought of Margaret, standing somewhere upon the frozen bank above, in her shawl, with her hands folded before her. He thought of the small brass token in the pocket of his moleskin trousers, warm still from the heat of his body. He thought that a token was not enough. A token was a thing the pit had given him. It was not a thing he had given her. Along the wall, a hewer of 40 stood up slowly. His name was George Sharp. He was a small man, thin at the shoulder, with a sharp fair beard and a soft voice that carried well in the low galleries. He had a wife named Sarah in the middle house of the upper row, and 4 children, the eldest a girl of 14, and the youngest a boy of 2. He had been at the coal that morning as usual. Now he stood in the yellow light of Thomas Ord's lamp, and he said, "I have a piece of slate." He drew it from the deep pocket of his moleskin trousers. It was a small square piece, about the size of a man's palm, broken from a larger sheet that had once served him for reckoning the count of his corves. Its edges were rough. Its face was smooth and dark. He held it up so that the men could see it, and he said, "And I have a bit of pencil." The pencil was of the sort that colliers carried, a stub of soft grey lead, no longer than a thumb, wrapped at one end in a scrap of cloth, to save the fingers from the black. He held it up beside the slate. A small murmur went through the men. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Every hewer in Hartley had carried such a slate at some hour of his working life. Every hewer had scratched upon it the count of his day's work, the number of his tubs, the mark of his hewer's row. Now the slate would carry something else. George Sharp went and sat down beside a lamp that was burning cleaner than the others. It was a lamp that Thomas Ord had trimmed with his own hands an hour before, packing the wick close and paring away the char. Its flame stood tall and steady. George Sharp set the slate upon his knee. He held the little grey stub of pencil in his right hand. He looked once at the wall of coats and shirts before him, and he looked once at the row of sleeping boys behind him, and then he lowered his eyes to the slate and began to write. He wrote slow. His hand was not a scholar's hand. He had learned his letters at the Hartley schoolroom when he was a boy, and he had not written much since. He formed each word carefully, with a small deliberate scratch of the lead upon the slate. The men about him did not watch him openly. They looked away, at the flame, or at the roof, or at their own knees. But every one of them was listening to the small dry sound of the pencil upon the stone. He wrote first the day and the hour, as best he knew them. Friday afternoon. He was not certain of the hour, and so he did not put it. He wrote next, "My dear Sarah." He paused a long moment there. The little pencil hung above the slate, and his hand shook very slightly, and he steadied it against his knee. Then he wrote on. He wrote that he was in the yard scene with the others, and that the air was still good, and that Thomas Ord was with them, and that they were well ordered. He wrote that if she should read these words, she was to know that he had not been afraid. He wrote that she was to kiss the children for him, and to tell the eldest girl to be gentle with the youngest boy, for the boy was small yet, and would not remember his father. He wrote that she was to keep the little iron kettle upon the hob, for it had been his mother's, and it would be good for many years yet. He wrote that he loved her, and that he loved the children, and that he commended them all to God. He signed it, George. He held the slate a long moment upon his knee. He looked at it. Then he wrapped it carefully in a scrap of clean cloth that he took from the inner pocket of his waistcoat, and he laid the cloth upon the folded coat where he had been sitting, and he sat down again beside it. He did not speak. He put his hand upon the cloth, and he left it there. A silence held the gallery for a little space. Then, without a word spoken, another hewer stood up. He had no slate. He drew from his belt a piece of white chalk, of the sort the shot men used for marking their bore-holes upon the coal. He walked to the wall of the gallery, where the stone was flat and dry, and he began to write upon it. He wrote his name in large clear letters. Thomas Watson. Beneath it he wrote, Wife Isabella. 3 bairns. Then he stepped back, and he looked at what he had written. He nodded once to himself, and he went back to his place against the wall, and he sat down. Another man rose. This one had no chalk. He took up a piece of the coal itself, a small hard lump the size of a walnut, and he broke it upon the floor until it made a jagged point, and he went to the wall and wrote with the coal. It made a black mark upon the black stone, but it could be read where the lamp fell upon it. He wrote his name, and the name of his wife, and the name of his old mother in the row. Another rose, and another. It went along the length of the yard seam in a slow, quiet order, as the taking off of the coats had gone, hours before. There was no jostling. There was no crowding. A man waited until the man before him had finished, and then he went to the wall in his turn, and he wrote what he had to write. Some wrote long. Some wrote only their names. One old hewer, whose hand had grown too heavy for such small letters, asked a younger man to write for him, and the younger man wrote what he was told, and read it back low, and the old hewer said, Aye, that is well, and went back to sit against the wall. The boys did not write. Most of them were asleep. The few who were awake watched the men with wide eyes above their coal dust, and did not ask what the writing was for. A boy of the pit understood many things without being told. The trapper of 8, who had sat all evening with his back against Michael Rie's knee, only looked once at the wall, and then closed his eyes again, and pressed his cheek harder against the old hewer's leg. The tubs also were written upon. 2 tubs stood in the gallery near the middle, where they had been left when the beam had broken. They had been half loaded with coal that morning. Now the coal was tipped out upon the floor, and the wooden sides of the tubs were bare. Men went to the tubs and wrote upon them with chalk and coal. They wrote their names, and the names of their wives, and small last words. One wrote, Tell my mother I have gone to my father before her. One wrote, God keep the bairns. One wrote only, Anne. That was all. Anne. Robert Amour did not go at once. He sat a long while against the wall, with his elder son John still under his arm, and he watched the others. He was thinking. He was thinking of Margaret and of the words he would put if he had a slate. He had no slate. He had no chalk. He had the small stub of pencil that he had used at his working place that morning, in the deep pocket of his moleskin trousers, beside the tally token. He had also, in the inner pocket of his waistcoat, a small folded scrap of paper, upon which he had reckoned the price of a new pair of boots for John. The reckoning was on one side of the paper. The other side was blank. He drew the paper out. He unfolded it. He smoothed it upon his knee. He took out the stub of pencil. He said, low, to his son John, Hold thy hand steady beneath the paper, lad, that it should not tear. John held his hand beneath the paper. He was 12 years old. He did not weep. He did not speak. He only held his hand there, and he watched the paper. Robert Amour wrote. He wrote slow, as George Sharp had written. He wrote to Margaret. He said the air was still fair. He said the boys were with him, both of them, and that they were well, and that little Thomas slept upon a folded coat and had a piece of bread beside him for when he should wake. He said that if she should read this letter, she was to remember that he had thought of her every hour, and that he had not been afraid, and that he had done his work as a hewer of Hartley should. He said she was to sell the small silver watch that his father had given him, for it would fetch £1, and to put the £1 toward the boots for the elder boy, if the elder boy should come up. He said she was to kiss both boys for him, if both boys should come up, and one, if only one. He said he loved her. He signed it, Robert. He folded the paper very small, and he put it back into the inner pocket of his waistcoat, and he buttoned the waistcoat over it. He did not lay it upon the wall or upon the tub. He kept it upon his own body, close to his heart, that whoever might find him should find it also. He looked at John. John looked at him. John said, at last, in a voice very low, "Shall I write, Father?" Robert Amur said, "Aye, lad, if thou wilt." John took the stub of pencil. His father tore for him a corner from the reckoning paper. John wrote upon it, very slow, in the careful round letters that Mr. Bewick had taught him at the schoolroom last Michaelmas. He wrote, "To my mother, Margaret Amur." He wrote, "I am with my father in the yard seam, and I am not afraid." He wrote, "God keep thee." He signed it, John Amur, aged 12. He folded it small. He put it into the pocket of his own moleskin waistcoat. He looked at his father. His father put his arm about him and said nothing. Along the wall of the gallery, the names went on. The chalk and the coal moved from hand to hand. A younger hewer, who had learned to write from his uncle only within the last year, was helped by an older man, and together they wrote a small message to a girl in the upper row who was not yet his wife, only his sweetheart, and to whom he had meant to speak at Whitsuntide. When it was done, he stepped back and read it once through, and his mouth trembled, and the older man laid a hand upon his shoulder and steadied him. At the far end of the wall, Thomas Ord himself wrote. He wrote in a firm hand. He wrote his own name, and the number of the shift, and the number of the souls with him. 204. He wrote it plain, for the record, so that whoever should come in first through the last broken timber might read it and know. He put down the chalk when he had done. He did not turn from the wall for a long time. The lamps burned lower. Thomas Ord and Michael Rie had trimmed each of them once, and now the oil was less. Some had begun to shrink and to blue at the base of the flame. A man near the middle of the company coughed once, and then could not stop coughing for a little while, and Michael Rie went to him with a folded kerchief and wet it in the last inch of the water can, and held it to the man's mouth, and the coughing eased. Robert Amur sat against the stone with John beside him, and he watched the wall of the gallery. He could see now, in the yellow light, the long, slow row of names written upon the stone, and upon the wooden sides of the tubs, and upon the folded coats, and upon the small square of slate that lay in its scrap of cloth beside George Sharp. It was a strange writing. It was not upon paper, and it was not in a book. It was upon the pit itself. He thought that if a man from the surface should ever come down into this gallery again, and hold up a lamp against the wall, he would read there the whole of Hartley in a single glance. He put his hand upon his younger son Thomas's forehead. The boy was still asleep. His breath came very small and even. Somewhere far off, beyond the brattice wall, a faint dry rattle began in the throat of the passage, as of the air itself catching upon a hidden splinter. Robert Amur heard it. Michael Rie heard it. Thomas Ord heard it, and stood up slowly from where he had been kneeling, and lifted his lamp, and began to walk again down the length of the yard seam, counting his lamps and his boys as he went. The breaking through. 6 days is a small number to write. A man may say it in a single breath. But 6 days at the mouth of a choked shaft, 6 days upon the frozen bank in a woolen shawl, 6 days of the pick and the rope and the slow black column of dust, is a length of time that stretches longer than a year. The village of Hartley did not sleep in those 6 days. The sinkers did not sleep. The women did not sleep. The children slept only where they fell, upon the frozen grass of the bank, wrapped in their mothers' shawls, and were carried down the lane to the cottages for an hour at a time, and were brought back again. The sinkers worked in pairs, as William Colson had ordered. They worked in short spells of 40 minutes, and no longer, for the air within the shaft had grown foul with the dust and with the sour breath that came up from below the choke. A pair went down upon the rope, and worked, and was drawn up, and rested. Another pair went down. The pick struck the iron. The iron gave, small piece by small piece. A length of pump rod was cut free. A slab of oak was sent down into the depths, or drawn up upon a second rope and laid in the yard. The choke grew slowly less. On the first night, the sinkers had cut through the topmost layer and made a hollow 3 feet deep. On the second day, they had cut through 5 feet more. On the third day, they had come at last upon the shattered timbers of the old brattice, and they had drawn out length after length of splintered oak and had passed it up the rope. On the fourth day, they had struck the great flat piece of the beam itself, black and cold now, and they had beat upon it with a sledge, and it had rung like a bell, and a woman upon the bank had covered her ears at the sound. William Coulson did not leave the yard. He slept 2 hours at a time upon a folded jacket beside the winding house wall, with his cap over his eyes, and he was woken by any man who thought he should know a thing. He ate what was brought to him, standing, with the tin plate in one hand and the pick in the other. He drank tea by the pint. He did not shave. His beard grew rough at the sides. His hands were cut in a dozen places, and the doctor had bandaged them in strips of clean linen, and the linen had gone black within the hour. Matthias Chapman worked beside him for the second day, and the third, until a fall of brick from the shaft wall caught him upon the ankle and turned it. He came up limping. He would not lie down. He sat upon the barrel by the winding house and sharpened picks for the other men, and he counted the coils of rope, and he watched the shaft, and he did not sleep. Christopher Barras, whose shoulder had been struck upon the first night, came back to the yard on the third morning, with his arm in a sling made of a woman's kerchief. He would not go down. William Coulson had forbidden it. So Barras carried lamps, and he carried water, and he carried tea, and he sat with the women upon the bank when there was no other work, and he told them, lo, what he had seen at the choke, and what he thought of the work that was left to do. The women listened. They did not weep. They only listened and asked small, quiet questions, and Barras answered as truly as he could. Word of the disaster had gone up the coast to Newcastle, and down the coast to Blythe, and inland to the towns of the moor. Sinkers came from farther pits. Doctors came from farther towns. A gentleman of the newspapers came from London upon the railway, and he stood upon the far side of the yard with a small book in his hand, and wrote in it slowly, and did not speak to any man. The Bishop of Durham sent a message, and the message was read aloud by the Reverend Charles Armstrong from the step of the chapel, and the message said that all England was praying for Hartley. A great crowd stood in the frost to hear it. When it was done, they went back to the bank, and they stood again, and they waited. Below the choke, in the yard seam, no man knew of these things. The gallery had grown very quiet. The lamps burned lower still. Thomas Ord had gathered every drop of oil from every lamp that had gone out, and he had poured it into the lamps that yet burned, and he had trimmed the wicks close, so that a small clean flame might last a little longer. There were now only 6 lamps yet alight in the yard seam. They stood in a row along the wall of coats, at even distances, and their flames were low and blue at the base. The men did not speak. Speaking cost breath. Michael Rie had said, on the second night, that a man in foul air should breathe slow and shallow, and should not talk, and should not move without cause. The men had heard him, and had obeyed. They lay upon the floor of the gallery, or sat against the wall, and they closed their eyes, and they did not speak. Some prayed under their breath. Some did not. The boys had grown very still. The youngest trapper of 8 had not opened his eyes for many hours. His head lay upon Michael Rie's knee, and Michael Rie had put his own coat over the child, and had kept his hand upon the child's shoulder, that he might feel the small movement of the breath. Robert Moore sat against the wall with his younger son Thomas across his lap, and his elder son John under his arm. The boy Thomas had woken once, and had eaten his piece of bread very slowly, and had drunk the small tin cup of tea, and had gone back to sleep. He had not cried. He had asked once for his mother, and Robert Moore had said, "She is above, lad, and she is waiting for thee." The boy had said, "Aye, father." Then he had closed his eyes. Robert Moore watched the flame of the nearest lamp. The flame stood only 2 fingers high now. It was blue at the base. It was yellow at the tip. It flickered small. On the 5th day above, the sinkers cut through a great mass of tangled pump rod and sent it down into the deep, and came suddenly upon a space of open shaft below it, 5 feet high, dark, and full of a heavy sour air. William Coulson himself went down into that space upon a fresh rope. He held his lamp before him. He saw the walls of the shaft, black and wet, streaked with rust. He saw the floor of the space, which was a great slab of stone that had come loose from the wall and lodged across the shaft. He saw, beyond the slab, more timber and more iron and more stone. The choke was not done, but the choke was thinner now. He came up. He said, "We shall be through by morning." The word went out among the sinkers, and it went out to the women upon the bank. A murmur passed along the shawls. Margaret Amour heard it. She did not move. Mary Sharp heard it. The child at her breast had grown fretful in the cold, and she had begged a small fire from the yardmen, and they had lit a brazier upon the bank for the wives of the cage men, and Mary Sharp sat now beside it, with the child upon her knee. She heard the word. She turned her face toward the shaft. She did not weep. She waited. The 6th day came grey and slow. The frost had not lifted for a week. The lane was hard as iron. The sea beyond the cliff was a heavy leaden grey, and the wind had dropped, and the smoke of the boilers rose straight into the sky, and did not lean either way. Somewhere down the coast a chapel bell rang once for a christening, and the sound came thin across the fields, and every woman upon the bank heard it, and none of them turned her head. At noon the sinkers struck through. The last great slab of stone gave under the pick, and it fell inward, and the 2 men upon the rope saw beneath them a black opening, and beyond the opening the low arched roof of the shaft inset. They gave the signal. They were drawn up. They came into the daylight with their black faces and their bright eyes, and they did not smile. They said only, "We are through, Willie." William Coulson said, "Aye." Then he said, "Get the tubs of tea ready, and get the blankets, and get the doctor to the shaft mouth." There was a stir upon the yard. Blankets were brought from the chapel and the schoolroom, brown blankets of coarse wool. Kettles were set to boil upon the braziers. The doctor came up to the shaft with his black bag. The Reverend Charles Armstrong came up with his prayer book. The women upon the bank rose slowly to their feet, all together, as if a single hand had lifted them. They did not press forward. They did not cry out. They only stood, in the shawls and the aprons, and watched. William Coulson himself went down. He would not send another. He tied the rope beneath his arms. He took his lamp. He took a small can of good sweet oil, and a spare wick, and a scrap of linen. He stepped over the broken brickwork. He went down. He passed through the space that had been the choke. He passed through the hole they had cut. He came out beneath it into the open shaft below, and he was lowered slowly down the last 100 feet, and he came at length to the pit bottom, and his boots touched the floor of the shaft inset. He stood a moment. He held the lamp before him. The inset was empty. The cage rope hung in a loose black coil upon the floor, as it had hung 6 days before. The pony that had been dragged clear was gone. A great pile of splintered timber lay against the far wall. The stable door was open. It was very still. He walked slowly along the low, sloping passage that led toward the yard seam. He held the lamp before him. He watched its flame. Within 20 paces the flame gave a small, quick tremble. Within 30 paces it shrank and turned blue at the base. Within 40 paces it went out. William Coulson stopped. He knew what he had walked into. He had known it since the first hour. He had said the word softly in the yard to Matthias Chapman on the 2nd day, and to no one else since. Afterdamp. The sweet murderous breath that comes into a pit after a fall or a fire, when the good air has gone and the foul has taken its place. It has no colour. It has no smell that a man can name. It only steals the strength from the knees and the sight from the eyes, and a man who breathes it long goes down as though for sleep and does not rise. He turned about. He walked back the way he had come. He walked slow, so as not to draw great breaths. He held the dead lamp before him. He came again to the shaft inset. He tugged the rope. He was drawn up. He came into the daylight, and the men at the winding gear saw his face, and they did not need to ask. He stepped over the broken brickwork. He stood a moment upon the frozen ground of the yard. He looked at William Coulson the villager, and at Matthias Chapman upon his barrel, and at the Reverend Charles Armstrong with his prayer book. Then he looked past them at the long dark line of the women upon the bank. He said, quiet, so that only the men near him could hear, "We are through. But the air below is dead." He said, "We shall need masks." He said, "We shall need long ropes and short shifts." He said, "We shall bring them up, but we shall bring them up slow." The Reverend Charles Armstrong closed his prayer book. He walked to the roped edge of the yard. He raised his hand. The women upon the bank saw the hand, and they grew still. Even the children grew still. The wind had dropped altogether now, and the sea was silent beyond the cliff, and somewhere far off a single gull called once, and the sound was thin and lost. The minister spoke. His voice was low. It was not the voice of a chapel. It was the voice of a man among his neighbours. He said, "The sinkers have broken through." He said, "The air below is very foul." He said, "We do not yet know what we shall find." He said, "But we shall bring them up, everyone, and we shall lay them in the schoolroom, and no man of Hartley shall lie in the dark this night." He did not say the word dead. He did not need to say it. Every woman upon the bank had understood him within the first sentence. A small sound went along the line of shawls. It was not a cry. It was a slow, indrawn breath, taken all together, as of a single body. Then it was quiet again. Margaret Amore stood very still. She had not moved for a long time. Her hands were folded before her, one upon the other. Her shawl was pulled up over her head against the frost. She was thinking of Robert, and of John, and of Thomas. She was thinking of the closed door of her cottage, and of the kettle upon the hob, and of the small blue bottle of cold tea she had filled for her husband 6 mornings before. She was thinking of the piece of paper in the inner pocket of his waistcoat, though she did not yet know that any such paper had been written. She was thinking that she had promised, in her heart, on the first afternoon, that she would not leave the yard until her boy Thomas was drawn up to the light. She meant to keep the promise. She did not know what the light would show her. Behind the minister, the sinkers were making their preparations. Wet cloths were being tied about their faces against the afterdamp. A fresh coil of rope was being lowered. William Coulson stood at the shaft mouth with his cap in his hand, and his grey and black beard rough at the sides, and his eyes very tired. He looked down into the dark. He said, low, to Matthias Chapman, "We shall go first to the yard seam, for that is where Tommy Ord will have gathered them." Matthias Chapman said, "Aye, Willie." William Coulson said, "And we shall carry no lamp that will spark, and we shall carry no word above until we are sure." Matthias Chapman said, "Aye." The women upon the bank drew a little nearer to one another beneath their shawls. The braziers burned low. The pale winter afternoon began, very slowly, to fade toward evening. And within the dark throat of the pit, William Coulson and his men set their boots upon the rope for the last descent, and were lowered together into the still air of the workings, where the 204 souls of Hartley were waiting to be found. The Long Procession. They brought them up slow, as William Coulson had said. It was the way of the pit, and it was the only way it could be done. A man could not be hurried from the deep. The afterdamp had settled thick in the low galleries, and every sinker who went down carried a wet cloth tied about his mouth, and a lamp with the wick pared close, and a length of rope about his waist. They worked in pairs, as before. They went down into the yard seam with the small dim light before them, and they knelt beside the men and the boys of Hartley, and they lifted each one gently, as a man lifts a sleeping child. The first to be brought up was a putter of 16, whose name was John Robinson. He was carried out upon the rope, with his cap still tied beneath his chin, and his belt still buckled about his waist. His face was very calm. His eyes were closed. The winter light fell upon him for the first time in 6 days, and it fell as it falls upon any sleeping thing, without judgment. The women upon the bank saw him drawn up out of the shaft, and they did not cry out. They only pressed a little closer together beneath their shawls, and the mother of John Robinson stepped forward once from the line, and then stepped back, and put her hand over her mouth, and did not fall. The doctor came to him at once. He knelt beside the boy upon the frozen ground. He put his ear to the boy's chest. He put his hand to the boy's wrist. He lifted the boy's eyelid with his thumb. Then he laid the boy's hand back upon his breast, and he looked up at the Reverend Charles Armstrong, and he shook his head, once, very small. The minister nodded. 2 men came forward with a stretcher of poles and canvas that had been used at the pit for many years to carry the injured, and they lifted John Robinson upon it, and they carried him down the lane toward the village. The schoolroom had been made ready. Mr. Bewick had left it at the first hour of the disaster, and he had not gone back to it since. Now the widow of the shop had swept it, and had taken down the slates from their pegs, and had laid the little wooden benches against the wall, and had covered the long deal tables with clean white cloths brought from every cottage of the row. Upon these tables the dead of Hartley were laid. The first was John Robinson. The next was a hewer of 30. The next was a boy of 10. The next was a hewer of 50. So they came, one by one, up the shaft and down the lane, and were laid in their places in the schoolroom, and the doors were kept open in the frost so that the air should stay clean. The women went in with buckets of warm water and clean rags. They did what the wives of colliers had done in Northumberland since the pit had first been dug. They washed the coal dust from the faces of the dead. They combed the hair with wooden combs. They straightened the collars of the flannel shirts, though many of the men had no shirts and no coats, for the shirts and the coats were still standing as a wall against the stithe in the yard seam below. Those men were washed as they were, in their bare shoulders and their moleskin trousers, and their skin beneath the coal was very pale, and the older women were gentle with them. Margaret Amor did not go into the schoolroom at first. She stood upon the bank still. She had watched the first stretcher come up the lane, and she had not gone to it, for it was not hers. She had watched the second, and the third, and the 10th. She waited. It was on the second day of the bringing up that the sinkers came at last to the far end of the yard seam, where the elder hewers had sat against the wall, and where the brattice of coats and shirts still stood as they had built it. They found Michael Riet there, with the small trapper of 8 yet upon his knee, and the old man's coat still folded over the child. They found George Sharp with the piece of slate wrapped in its scrap of clean cloth beside his hand. They found Thomas Ord with his lamp beside him, the wick burned to nothing. They found Robert Amor against the wall, with his elder son John under his arm, and his younger son Thomas across his lap, and the small folded scrap of paper still buttoned within the inner pocket of his waistcoat. The sinkers who found them did not speak. They lifted each one in turn. They carried father and sons up the shaft together, upon the same rope, one after the other in a slow order, so that the boy Thomas came into the daylight last, still wrapped in the coat that had been laid across him. The winter sun was low above the sea. The frost had come down again in the night, and the yard was white, and the smoke of the boilers went straight up into a pale sky. Margaret Amor was standing at the edge of the bank. She saw her boys drawn up. She saw her husband drawn up. She did not cry out. She walked slowly down from the bank, in her shawl and her clogs, and she came to the place where they were laid upon the frozen ground beside the shaft, and she knelt down beside them. She put her hand upon Robert's cheek. It was cold. She put her hand upon John's forehead. It was cold. She put her hand upon Thomas's small hand, folded upon his breast. It was cold also. She sat back upon her heels. She looked at the 3 of them a long moment. Then she took the folded scrap of paper from the inner pocket of Robert's waistcoat, though she did not yet unfold it. She put it into the pocket of her own apron. She rose. She said to the 2 men with the stretcher, in a voice very small and very level, "Take them home together." They carried the 3 of them down the lane in a single procession, upon 3 stretchers, one behind the other. Margaret walked beside them. She did not weep. That would come later, in the cottage, when the door was shut, and the kettle was on the hob, and the little iron lay quiet upon the shelf, and there was no one but her to hear it. Now she walked, and her clogs made their hard flat sound upon the frozen lane, and the women upon the bank drew back to let her pass, and no one spoke. So it went for 4 days, until the last of them was brought up. 204 names in all. The 8 of the ascending cage had been found first in the choke itself, where the beam had crushed them, and they had been drawn up and laid apart in a small side chamber of the schoolroom, for they were not fit to be seen by any wife. The others came up whole, and were washed, and were dressed in what clean linen the village could find. Every cottage gave up its Sunday shirts. Every drawer was emptied of its handkerchiefs. The widow of the shop gave up her whole small stock of black cloth for the making of armbands, and when it was gone the women dyed their own aprons in a great pot behind the chapel, and hung them upon the lines to dry, and wore them at the burying. The coffins were made in Blyth and in Seaton and in North Shields, and they came in wagons down the coast road, one wagon after another, through the frost and the cold sea wind. There were not enough joiners in Northumberland to make them fast enough, and so joiners came from Newcastle, and from Sunderland, and from Durham, and they worked in the open yard behind the chapel by the light of oil lamps, and their planes and their hammers were heard all through the nights. The coffins were of plain deal unstained with brass nails. Upon the lid of each was written in white paint the name of the man or boy within, and his age, and the number of his row. The paint dried slow in the winter air. The burying was upon the 26th day of January, and upon the days that followed. The little chapel at Hartley could not hold them. The churchyard at Hartley could not hold them either. So they were carried the 2 miles to Earsden, where the old parish church of St. Albans stood upon its low green rise, and where a great pit had been opened in the churchyard for the many who would lie there together. The wagons went slow along the coast road. There were many wagons. There were many horses. The coast road, which had carried the sinkers hurrying down at a gallop only 10 days before, now carried the dead of Hartley walking home to the earth. The procession was 3 miles long. It began at the schoolroom of Hartley, and it ended at the gate of Earsden churchyard, and every foot of it was lined with people. They had come from Newcastle upon the railway. They had come from Blyth and Seaton and Whitley upon the coast road. They had come from the moors above, in their farm carts. They had come from as far as Durham and Sunderland. They stood in the fields upon either side of the road, in the frost, with their hats in their hands. When a wagon passed, the men bowed their heads. The women crossed themselves, or bowed their heads, or wept, according to their kind. The children were held in silence. Not a dog barked upon the coast road that day. The sea beyond the cliff lay still and grey, and it did not speak either. Margaret Amour walked behind the wagon that carried her 3. She had asked that Robert and John and Thomas be laid in a single wide grave together, and the vicar of Earsden had said aye to her, and it was done. She walked in her black shawl, with the folded paper still in the pocket of her apron. Mary Sharp walked behind another wagon, with the child at her breast, and her own mother upon her arm. Sarah Sharp, the widow of George, walked behind another, with her 4 children about her, and the little square of slate wrapped in its scrap of clean cloth held against her heart. The wives of the 8 cage men walked, and the wives of the trappers, and the wives of the putters, and the mothers, and the sisters, and the sweethearts of the young hewers. There were more black shawls upon that road than there had ever been at any christening or at any wedding in the memory of the coast. They came at length to Earsden. The bells of the church rang once, very slow, and then again, and did not stop. The pit in the churchyard was long and deep, and the earth of Northumberland lay in a great dark bank beside it. The coffins were carried down into it, one after another, and were laid side by side, 3 deep in the earth, in the order of the rows of the village. 204 coffins. The vicar of Earsden read the office for the dead, and the Reverend Charles Armstrong of Hartley read it also, and the wind came off the sea and lifted the pages of their books, and turned them, and they read on. When it was done, the earth was closed over them. It took many hours. The women stood at the edge of the grave in the falling dark, and they watched the shovels rise and fall in the yellow lamplight. Margaret Amour stayed until the last shovelful was upon the last coffin, and she felt no more cold in her feet, and no more wind upon her cheek. And when the sexton at last touched her elbow and said, "Missus, thou shouldst go home now," she said, "Aye," and she went. The village of Hartley did not lie in the dark that first night after the burying. Every cottage kept a candle in its window until dawn. The little iron kettle upon Margaret Amour's hob was cold when she came in. and she did not light it. She sat in the wooden chair beside the hearth, and she took the folded paper from her apron, and she smoothed it upon her knee by the light of the single candle, and she read at last what Robert had written. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she put it into the small tin box upon the mantel where the household papers were kept, and she closed the lid, and she blew out the candle, and she sat a long while in the dark. Now the listener may know that in the years which followed, the sorrow of Hartley was carried into the halls of Parliament, and a new law was written for the pits of the land. From that year, no colliery in England was to be worked with a single shaft. 2 shafts, always 2, that no village should ever again stand upon a bank in the frost while their men were sealed beneath a broken beam. This law was the last gift of the 204 to the trade they had died in. It was passed in the summer of that same year. The masters did not always love it. The colliers' wives blessed it. At Earsdon churchyard there stands a tall stone, put up in the years afterward by the subscription of the whole country, from the pennies of children and the pounds of great houses, and upon the stone are cut the names of every man and every boy who lies beneath. The names go on for a long time. They are cut deep, that the wind and the rain of the coast shall not wear them for many years. Margaret Amour's 3 are among them, together, in the order she asked. George Sharp is among them. Thomas Ord is among them. Michael Riet is among them, and beside his name is the name of the small trapper of 8 who died upon his knee. When the sea wind comes off the water in the winter, and the frost is upon the low green rise, the letters of the stone stand out very clear. The candle beside the reader has burned low. The village of Hartley has gone to sleep at last. In the schoolroom, the long deal tables are empty, and the white cloths have been folded and put away. In the winding house upon the low hill, the great pumping engine stands cold and still, and the broken halves of the beam lie in the yard, and a light snow has begun to settle upon them. Beyond the cliff, the North Sea rocks slow upon the stones, as it has done since long before the shaft was sunk, and as it will do long after the last name upon the stone at Earsdon is worn away. The lamp is low, the chamber is still, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark.